Luke Bennett never thought he'd see her again. Yet, there she was, Emily Parker, the girl who once mocked him in school, standing on a freezing street corner, clutching her two small daughters. Her clothes were tattered, her face hollow with exhaustion. The memory of her laughter at his expense in the school hallways clashed violently with the image before him. Life had been cruel, and fate, even crueler. Luke's heart pounded. He should have walked away, ignored the past, but something inside him wouldn't let him. He hesitated, but then his feet moved on their own.
Hello, I'm the storyteller of the channel, and I would like to ask for a second of your time to subscribe, activate the notification bell, and like the video so that YouTube can take our story to more people who are passionate about stories like this. Thank you, and without further ado, let's continue with our story.
Emily. His voice was softer than he expected. She flinched, pulling her children closer, her eyes darting with fear and shame. She recognized him immediately. How could she not? The boy she once humiliated had turned into a man of wealth and power. A millionaire. Yet, instead of gloating, his eyes held something she hadn't seen in years: kindness. Emily swallowed hard. She had lost everything, but the weight of her past mistakes crushed her more than her poverty. Luke saw the terror in her eyes. She expected him to laugh, to rub her downfall in her face. After all, wasn't that what she had done to him all those years ago? But instead, he knelt to the level of her daughters, his voice gentle. "Are you girls hungry?" The little ones looked up at their mother, too afraid to answer. Emily clenched her jaw, her pride battling her desperation. She had spent years avoiding pity, yet here was a man she once belittled, offering her something no one else had: mercy. The wind howled around them, cutting through Emily's thin coat. Her body trembled, whether from the cold or the shame, she wasn't sure. Luke removed his own coat, draping it over her shoulders without asking. It was instinctual, something automatic. Emily tried to protest, but he raised a hand. "Don't. Just take it." His voice was firm, yet understanding. It wasn't just a coat. It was a lifeline, a warmth she hadn't known in years, maybe longer. Her daughters clung to her legs, their innocent eyes darting between the two adults. Emily felt exposed, vulnerable. She didn't want to owe him anything. Yet, deep down, a part of her, one she had buried under years of hardship, whispered that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do this alone anymore. But could she trust him? Could she trust anyone? Her fingers tightened around the fabric of his coat. It was the first time in years she had felt anything close to safe. Luke could see the battle raging inside her. She was too proud to beg, but too broken to refuse. He had spent years resenting her, replaying the humiliation she had caused him. And yet, looking at her now, he didn't feel triumph. He felt something else, something dangerous, compassion. A quiet voice inside whispered that this moment was bigger than revenge, bigger than the past. This was fate knocking, his chance to do what no one did for him back then. Extend a hand, even when it wasn't deserved. The streetlights flickered, the city's noise fading into the background. Emily swallowed hard, eyes glossy. "Why are you doing this?" The question was barely a whisper. Luke inhaled sharply, his gaze steady. "Because sometimes life gives you a second chance, even when you don't deserve it." His words hung between them, heavy with unspoken history. Emily didn't respond, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope, just a little. And that was all it took. Emily didn't sleep that night. She sat in the small motel room Luke had paid for, her daughters curled up beside her, finally warm after too many nights on the streets. She still didn't understand why he was doing this. People didn't help without expecting something in return. She had learned that the hard way. But Luke? He had barely spoken after checking them in, just left the key on a nightstand and said, "Sleep. We'll talk tomorrow." And then he was gone. Morning came, and with it a knock on the door. Emily hesitated before opening it, half expecting Luke to change his mind, to take back whatever mercy he had given. But there he was, holding a bag of breakfast and a duffel of fresh clothes for the girls. "Eat first, then we'll figure things out," he said, stepping inside. She studied him, searching for the catch. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Because I can. Luke had already made up his mind. He wasn't just giving Emily a warm bed for the night. He was giving her a way out. He had seen enough people fall through the cracks, and he refused to let her become another statistic. You don't have to struggle anymore, he told her, leaning forward. Let me help. Emily's chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, but trust wasn't something she gave easily. I don't take handouts, she muttered. Luke shook his head. Then don't. Take an opportunity. He laid out a plan, an apartment, a job, a real chance to rebuild. Emily felt dizzy just listening. It sounded too good, too impossible. She had been fighting alone for so long. The idea of accepting help felt foreign. I don't deserve this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Luke leaned back, studying her. No one deserves to suffer either, he countered. I'm not offering charity, Emily. I'm offering a reset. And just like that, the ground beneath her seemed less shaky. Her daughters, unaware of the weight of the conversation, beamed at the sight of food. They trusted too easily, something Emily both envied and feared. As they ate, she let herself imagine what Luke was offering. A roof, stability, a chance to be something more than a woman people pitted on the sidewalk. Could she really step into a new life just like that? But then she looked at her daughters, at the way they devoured their breakfast like they didn't know when their next meal would come. She had to try. Luke saw the war in her eyes, the way she fought against the urge to hope. He wouldn't force her to accept, but he wouldn't let her refuse out of pride either. Let me help you stand, he said softly. And when you're ready, you can walk on your own. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. She had spent years surviving. Maybe it was time to start living. Maybe, just maybe, Luke was the one person who wouldn't let her fall. The papers for the apartment were ready. The job was waiting. All she had to do was say yes. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the contract he had placed on the table. She wasn't signing away her independence. She was signing up for a future. She exhaled slowly, gripping the pen. Okay, she whispered. Luke simply nodded. No celebration, no grand moment, just an understanding that everything had changed. And this was only the beginning. The apartment was small but clean. For the first time in years, Emily had a key to a place she could call home. She traced the edges of it between her fingers, still half expecting it to vanish like some cruel trick. Her daughters ran through the empty living room, their laughter bouncing off the walls. It had been too long since she'd heard that sound. Luke watched from the doorway, arms crossed, a small smirk tugging at his lips. Not bad, huh, he said. Emily nodded, but the weight in her chest didn't lift. A roof was a start, but was it enough? Luke wasn't done. Giving her shelter was one thing, but she needed something more, something permanent. You should go back to school, he told her one evening as they sat across from each other in the new apartment. Emily scoffed. You think a degree is going to fix everything? She challenged. I think it's going to give you choices, he replied. His voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. Emily looked away. It had been years since she had dreamed of anything beyond survival. Could she even do it? Doubt clawed at her. She wasn't a teenager anymore. She had kids, bills, responsibilities. School wasn't an option. It was a luxury. I can't afford it, she said flatly. Luke leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. That's not a problem. His words were so casual, as if paying for her education was as easy as buying coffee. I'll cover it. Emily shook her head. I can't let you do that. But Luke wasn't asking for permission. You're not letting me do anything. I'm investing in you. The idea scared her more than the streets ever had. What if she failed? What if she wasn't smart enough? She had spent so many years being invisible, fading into the background, that the thought of stepping forward felt impossible. But then she thought of her daughters, the way they looked at her like she was the strongest person in the world. What kind of example would she set if she turned down the chance to be better? To give them a future that wasn't built on scraps? Luke saw the hesitation flicker in her eyes, but he didn't push. Instead, he slid a stack of papers toward her. There's a program for single mothers. Flexible hours, childcare support. You won't have to do this alone. Emily's fingers hovered over the forms. The excuses bubbled up, but none of them felt real anymore. What if I fail? She asked, barely above a whisper. Luke's gaze held hers. Then you get back up and try again. His certainty was unnerving. No one had ever believed in her like this. The words lingered in the air, pressing against the walls of her doubt. Maybe she couldn't erase the past, but she could rewrite the future. She swallowed hard, picked up the pen, and signed. Her hand trembled, but she did it. Luke's smirk returned. "Good choice," he said, leaning back. Emily exhaled, trying to ignore the way her chest tightened. She had fought life alone for so long. Having someone in her corner felt unfamiliar, maybe even dangerous. But it was real, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe. School wouldn't fix everything overnight, but it was a step, a small, terrifying step. As Luke stood to leave, he glanced over his shoulder. "First day's Monday," he said, grinning. Emily rolled her eyes, but couldn't fight the small smile creeping onto her lips. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something bigger. And she wasn't as alone as she thought. Days turned into weeks, and Emily started adjusting to her new life. School was overwhelming at first, deadlines, essays, the fear of failing. But every time she doubted herself, she thought of Luke's words. "Then you get back up and try again." And she did. She studied late into the night after putting her daughters to bed, fueled by sheer determination. But no matter how much progress she made, a shadow still loomed over her past. Once she tried to bury Joshua, the man who had promised forever and left her in the dirt. Luke saw it before she ever said a word. He noticed the way she tensed at certain memories, how she avoided talking about her daughter's father. So he did what Luke Bennett did best. He dug for answers. It didn't take long to find Joshua. A few calls, some quiet favors, and there was his address, his life. And it was nothing like Emily's. While she had been scraping by, sleeping on sidewalks, Joshua had moved on as if she had never existed. New job, new house, a life untouched by the damage he had left behind. Emily didn't want to know. She didn't want to hear his name, much less see him. "What does it change?" she asked, voice sharp. "I don't need closure." Luke disagreed. "You need to face him." He placed a piece of paper on the table, Joshua's address. Emily's stomach turned. She had spent years convincing herself she was fine, that his betrayal hadn't broken her. But now, staring at that address, she realized the truth. She had just learned to live with the cracks. The confrontation wasn't planned. One afternoon, after a long day at school, she found herself in front of his house. It was ridiculous, standing there, heart pounding, staring at the door of a man who once meant everything. She wasn't sure if she wanted to scream or run. Before she could decide, the door swung open, and there he was, older but still the same. He blinked at her, confused at first, then uncomfortable. "Emily." His voice was a ghost from a life she barely recognized. She expected anger to take over, but instead, all she felt was exhaustion. "Did you ever wonder what happened to me?" she asked, arms crossed, voice steady. Joshua shifted, avoiding her gaze. I thought you'd be fine." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Fine." The word tasted like poison. He had walked away from her and their children without a second thought, and now he couldn't even look her in the eye. But she didn't need his excuses. She didn't need anything from him. Joshua fumbled for words, but Emily cut him off. "You don't matter anymore," she said simply. And for the first time, she meant it. She had spent too many years letting his absence define her. But he wasn't a missing piece. He was just a mistake she survived. She turned to leave, but before she did, she gave him one last look. "They don't even know your name," she said, referring to their daughters. "And they never will." The weight she had carried for years, it vanished. Luke was waiting outside when she returned. She didn't have to say a word. He saw it in her eyes, lighter, freer. She exhaled, and for the first time in forever, she wasn't running from the past. She had faced it, crushed it, and left it behind. Luke smirked. "Told you." Emily rolled her eyes, but there was no irritation, just something new, relief. And as they walked away from the past, something else was waiting ahead. Something she never saw coming. Life felt different, lighter. Emily no longer carried the weight of the past, and for the first time, she looked ahead without fear. School was no longer a burden, but a challenge she welcomed. Her daughters were thriving, finally safe and happy. And then there was Luke. Always there, always steady. He had started as an unexpected savior, but somewhere along the way, he had become something more. A constant presence, a quiet protector, a friend. Or at least, that's what she kept telling herself. But feelings are tricky things. They creep up on you when you least expect them. A glance held too long. A brush of fingertips when passing a cup of coffee. A warmth in his voice when he said her name. Emily had spent years avoiding anything that resembled love. Love had ruined her once before. And yet, when she looked at Luke, it didn't feel like a risk. It felt like home. But was she brave enough to let him in? Luke wasn't a man who rushed things. He had given Emily space when she needed it, support when she asked for nothing. But he wasn't blind. He saw the way her guard had lowered, the way she looked at him differently now. And so, one evening, as they sat on her couch, her daughter's asleep in the next room, he finally spoke the words that had been lingering between them. "You know, I don't do this for just anyone," he said, smirking. Emily raised a brow. "What? Buy apartments and change lives?" He chuckled. "No. Wait." A pause. "Care." Silence settled between them, thick with meaning. Emily's pulse quickened. She had spent so much time running from love, but here it was sitting right in front of her. No grand declarations. No dramatic confessions. Just honesty. Just Luke. And in that moment, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. She didn't have to be. "I know," she whispered. That was all she needed to say, because the truth had already been written in every moment leading up to this one. Luke never pressured her. He simply stayed, patient and unwavering. Days passed, weeks, and slowly, Emily allowed herself to lean into the feeling. The first time he kissed her, it wasn't fireworks or passion. It was something deeper, a quiet promise, a reassurance that this time, love wouldn't be her downfall. It would be her salvation, and she let it happen. She let him in, because, for once, she wasn't looking for an escape. She was looking for forever. Months later, Luke stood in front of her daughters, a nervous glint in his usually confident eyes. He knelt down, holding a small velvet box, and before he even spoke, Emily's breath caught in her throat. "I'm not just asking your mom," he said, voice soft. "I'm asking you too as well. Can I be part of your family?" The girls squealed in excitement, and Emily, who had spent a lifetime believing love was cruel, felt tears spill down her cheeks. The answer was obvious. It had been written in every moment leading up to this one. Luke wasn't just a man who saved her from a cold. He was the man who had shown her that love could be safe, that could be kind. And as she whispered yes, slipping the ring onto her finger, she realized something incredible. She hadn't just found love. She had found a new beginning. And this time, she wasn't looking back.